How come the liberal is so happy being ignorant? Evan Sayet has written a book called The Kindergarten of Eden, How the Modern Liberal Thinks. This is my adding on, or does not, as the case may be. Sort of feels and emotes, I guess we could perhaps say. But Evan, this is a really good book.
Well, I'm continuing to write it. I just knew that I needed to get this part out because so many of us, we're dumbfounded at the left. Because, look, I'm not talking about Marxists, because we know how Marxists think. We know why they side with evil, failure, and wrong, because they want to undermine our system and replace it with theirs. We know how the Islamist thinks. And we know why they side with evil, failure, and wrong, because they want to destroy our system and replace it with theirs, with Sharia law. But why does my cousin, why does my friend, why does my neighbor intentionally ignore the facts in order to side with everything that's evil, failed, and wrong? That's what my book is about. It's not about the left-wing ideologue. It's more about our friends and our neighbors and our colleagues who really don't have an ideology, and yet they will blindly vote Democrat and blindly support everything that's wrong.
Hence the further subtitle, and why the liberals convinced that ignorance is bliss.
Absolutely. What I've done is, I don't know if you've had an opportunity to watch the original lecture that I gave to the Heritage Foundation. That was back in 2007, Larry, and it is the single most viewed lecture in Heritage Foundation's history.
Well, it had an encomium from Andrew Breitbart, so that's pretty heavy stuff.
Now, more news about the threats to your liberties and your right to keep and bear arms. This is the Gun Owners News Hour. And here once again is your host, Executive Director of Gun Owners of America, Larry Pratt.
Talking today with Evan Sayet, author of The Kindergarten of Eden, is the way you can find it on Amazon.com. Better to go to evansayet.com, EVANSAYET.com. Not only can you find the book there, but also other information about my guest today. I really appreciate your having written this book because it helped to explain in a systematic fashion what I have been screaming about, that here we've had 20 years of gun-free zone legislation on the books, federal and most states combined. All of our mass murders, save one, in that same period of time have taken place in a gun-free zone.
Exactly. And yet that fact is something that the liberal will not factor into their thinking, which again is why the subtitle is, and why they're convinced that ignorance, denying and ignoring the facts, why ignorance is bliss. Let me just go back to that 2007 lecture, because when I went, and you're right, just before the break you pointed out, Andrew Breitbart, who I barely knew at the time, called that speech one of the 5 most important conservative speeches ever given, because it did, in fact, lay out, as you just pointed out, in a systematic fashion how it is they think. And so this book takes that original lecture and just makes it clearer, makes it, I expand and I expound upon that original talk. And what I do is I lay out the 4 laws and the 3 corollaries of the modern liberal ideology, what I call not just I, what many, many people independently have called the unified field theory of liberalism. I think really the only 2, and I do want to get back to gun control, obviously, because that is the central issue here, but let me lay out the first 2 laws and then show how gun control fits in. The first law, I'm going to lay it out the way I wrote it in the book, and then I'm going to explain. The first law is the modern liberal was raised to believe that indiscriminateness is a moral imperative because its opposite is discrimination. Larry, in the 1980s, thinking was officially outlawed. Right?
Yes. Happily, I went to college just before that.
Yeah, because the 1980s was when the children of the 60s, the first generation born after World War II, born into a world where they didn't have to think about things like disease, hunger, poverty, and physical pain, because they'd all been eradicated by science. They'd all been, what disease did you have to be smart to avoid? Because by the time the 1960s came around, polio was vanquished, smallpox was vanquished, chickenpox was vanquished, the flu, which had not all that long ago in the scheme of things wiped out 2/3 of a continent, was now a 3-day paid vacation where you sat on your lazy boy reclining rocker and you watched one of any of 200 or 300 TV channels.
And not only had science made things so wonderful in that material sense, but we were still, although we were certainly rapidly undoing it, but we were still benefiting from a Christian origin of the country, a Judeo-Christian ethic that made this a nice place to live. There was some restraint on the part of government. They couldn't be thugs, at least most of the time.
I point out, as you know, in the book, that's an essential argument that I make, that the success of Western civilization in general had been because of this balance that was struck between the scientific and the extra-scientific. God, beauty, morality, decency, things that can't be recreated in the laboratory.
Right.
What I like to call the balance between Athens and Jerusalem.
That's
in
a
fact,
good
after
poll.
World War II, we had the near perfect balance in America. And if you look at the two miraculous nations on this planet, you've got the Judeo-Christian America, and you've got the Jewish state of Israel, the two places where religion is still, where the rightful religions, where the good religions are still central, and where there is this balance between the tangible and the intangible, between God and science.
Although I think in both countries there's a concerted effort by many of whom are in power to do away with the favor that religion has found with government.
No doubt about it. In fact, those are the liberals. But they're not just trying to get rid of God. They're trying to get rid of science as well.
Yeah.
I mean, look at what happened to this guy Larry Summers at Harvard University, where he suggested, he was the president of Harvard. He's a big-time leftist. He's a big-time liberal. But he suggested in a scientific forum that...
We're talking about thinking today, or perhaps the lack thereof. The Garden of Eden deals with how the modern liberal thinks and why he's convinced that ignorance is bliss. And if you go to evansayet.com, EVANSAYET.com, you can get a copy of this book, and it's really, I think it's going to be extremely helpful when you are trying to get through to some of the folks that are in this cloud that has been stuck around them ever since they've been in school. It's in the media. It's pretty pervasive, and they're not going to likely be aware of how it is that they've been so impaired. That's the whole reason for having been impaired, so they can't see the damage that was done to them.
That's exactly
they think
right. Yep.
They're like the blind person who, and I've heard of this clinically happening, who's convinced that he can see like he used to be able to see. Well, we're talking about people that are blind and think they can see. That's pretty dangerous, actually, when you let them get behind the wheel of a car.
It's not only dangerous, but because they think they see more clearly than anybody else. Because let me go back very quickly. We were talking about Lawrence Summers, rather, at Harvard,
right.
at Harvard University. And what happened was, the fact is that women reach the highest levels of complex mathematical studies at a far lesser rate than do men. That's simply the statistical fact that they were addressing at this scientific symposium. And one of several possibilities as to why that Summers said needs to be looked into is the possibility that perhaps men and women process mathematical information differently. Well, that's obviously true, but it's a truth that's not allowed to be spoken because men and women have to be seen as exactly the same. So not only did they not look into this possibility, but the man lost his job for even suggesting it. So the point that we were making was it's not just God that the liberals are trying to eliminate from society, it's science as well. I'll give you another quick example that's in the book. They kept telling us that AIDS was an equal opportunity disease, when in fact it was a disease that was transmitted through the spread of semen, and it was a overwhelmingly homosexually transmitted disease. That's simply the fact. But they're not allowed to speak the fact because that might make homosexuality look different or bad or wrong, and therefore they're not allowed to engage in scientific fact. So their goal is actually to eliminate both God and science.
You describe yourself as a September 13th Republican. That's a very interesting way to put it. Obviously, the implication being, before that date, you bought into the Kindergarten of Eden.
Very much so. I mean, I grew up a New York City-born liberal Jew. It wasn't an intelligent liberalism. In fact, there is no such thing as an intelligent liberalism. We laugh, but it's absolutely true. I have an expression: the first time you think is the last time you're a Democrat. It was just simply, as Breitbart would have said, that was simply the default factory setting for somebody born into those demographics, a New York City-born liberal Jew.
Well, I had been a liberal in good standing into graduate school, and then the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred. And professors that had, none of them conservative, as I later came to learn, but they would go after each other hammer and tong from different points of view within the liberal spectrum. But as soon as the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred, they all had the same recommendation. Roll over, play dead, don't fight back, don't speak harshly to the Soviet Union.
That's right. Do not stand up to evil. You'll recall from the book and from this conversation, the modern liberal will invariably side with evil over good.
So that was my September 11 moment. No, I was just saying that we've both had the same experience, different days on the.
And we did, but as you noted, I call myself a September 13th Republican because 9/11 didn't surprise me, Larry. Obviously, I didn't know the date. I didn't know the target. The carnage literally sickened me. But even as a brain-dead liberal, I knew just enough about the realities of the world to know that the same people who were massacring the Jews of Israel for no other reason than they were the closest infidels, who were massacring the Hindus in India for no other reason than they were the closest infidels, who were murdering children in Beslan, Russia, for no other reason than they were the closest infidels, would, when they could, come and massacre the biggest infidel, the great Satan. Mm-hmm. What truly surprised me is what I metaphorically call 9/12. That's the days, the weeks, and the months, and now the years after 9/11, and my liberal friends' response to the attacks. Like your professor's response to the Cuban Missile Crisis was to champion the Soviet Union. When I heard the President of the United States' spiritual mentor, Jeremiah Wright, say that we deserved the attacks because it was the chickens coming home to roost. When I heard the college professor, the chairman of the department at a major university, say they all deserve to be burned alive in their places of employ because every American is a little Eichmann. When I heard the liberals say that the way to prevent further attacks was to be nicer to the terrorists, this was something that was insane to me, Larry. I had to figure out how it is. Here we were facing the greatest example of good versus evil of my lifetime. Everything liberals are supposed to hate, religious fanatics who hijack an airplane, slit the throats of the stewardesses, murder the pilots, and ram civilian jetliners into civilian office towers, burning thousands of innocent people alive, and they take the side of the terrorists. This was something I had to look into. I knew at that point that was not well found.
Well, it's a remarkable thing when it happens, when your thinking gets so rammed into reality, and interesting that we both had a somewhat similar moment. I found it very helpful because you kind of analytically described it. It's not a polemical book, although I'm sure a lot of liberals would throw up if they read it. But really, you were quite restrained in your description of just how goofy they are and how dangerously goofy they are. And I think I'm sorry, Larry. I'm from New York, so I interrupt. That's what I do. No, that's fine. This is a conversation. Go ahead.
Yes, I really tried to lay it out as almost scientifically. I didn't want it to be boring. I didn't want it to be academic. I didn't want it to be filled with words that sounded pretty but had no relationship to the truth. But I lay out what has been called dozens of times independently the unified field theory of liberalism. And if I may, let me, because we started to do this, let me go through the first two laws, because they will explain virtually everything right there. And again, I'll give it the way It's stated in the book, which is that the modern liberal was raised to believe that indiscriminateness is a moral imperative because its opposite is discrimination. The idea is that anything an individual thinks is going to have been so tainted by his personal prejudices. Prejudices we all have. Prejudices we can't help but have is simply part of the human condition. Prejudices based on things like the color of your skin, the nation of your ancestry, your height, your weight, your sex, and so on. Anything that an individual believes is going to have been so tainted by his personal prejudices that the only way not to be a bigot is to never think at all.
That's
right. The second law is just as essential, which is that indiscriminateness of thought doesn't lead to indiscriminateness of policy. Indiscriminateness of thought leads invariably, inevitably. There is no place else it can lead but to the modern liberal siding with evil, failure, and wrong and against the good, right, and successful. Why? Because if nothing, if no culture, if no religion, if no form of government, if no behavior, if nothing is better than anything else, then success is unjust. Why should a nation, why should America succeed if we're not better than any other nation?
It means that for us who are successful, we must have ripped somebody off.
Oh, absolutely. By definition, if you didn't build your business, then A, it's unfair that you have a successful business, and the failure, why didn't somebody build him a successful business? If nothing is better than anything else, think about this. President Obama was asked point blank, do you believe in American exceptionalism? He gave a very clever, very politic answer in which he said yes, but then made very clear that he meant no. What he said was, yes, I believe in American exceptionalism, just as I'm sure the Brits believe in British exceptionalism and the Greeks believe in Greek exceptionalism. In other words, any feelings that he might have for America are not from his intellect. He didn't compare the constitutions. He didn't compare the Judeo-Christian heritage. He didn't compare the legal system or the Protestant work ethic and say, yes, America is exceptional. At best, he said, yes, I think America is exceptional because I live here. It's kind of like somebody being asked if they think the Chicago Cubs are an exceptional baseball team. If you use your brain, the answer is no. If you live in Chicago, you might say yes. But here's the problem. Because he's not allowed to use his brain to recognize the exceptional, because he was raised to believe that indiscriminateness is a moral imperative, because he's not allowed to discriminate between the better and the lesser, now you have to ask yourself, how is he to explain America's economic success? How is he to explain that America is so strong? If we're nothing special, not only is our success unjust, but given that we are the most successful nation in human history, Barack Obama and those who share his ideology have no choice but to conclude that America is the greatest injustice in all of human history.
And this would explain the president's apology tour shortly after being installed in office, because we had so much to apologize for because we had...
Absolutely, and it would explain the outright lie that is taught to our children in the schools that America is an imperialist nation, because the leftist needs an explanation for our success that doesn't say our culture has garnered this success. So they have to make up some lie along the way that says we stole our success. America, an imperialist nation? Well, we're the least imperialist major power in all of human history. And
now, here's something that they'll point to the fact that we've got garrisons of troops in many different places around the world. They're there as cops. They're not sucking those countries dry. There's no imperialistic relationship that benefits us economically. Au contraire.
Exactly. The modern liberal is not only always wrong, he is as wrong can be. His every belief diametrically opposed to the truth. That's how it's worded in the book. That's how it's worded in my speech, and there's a perfect example. Au contraire, as you just said. It's exactly the opposite. So I was going to give you an example using gun control.
Shoot, as we say.
Because the modern liberal is not allowed to recognize good and evil, right and wrong, bad and good, they will not discriminate between who the gun owner is. They will indiscriminately confiscate guns from the good and the evil which in the end, of course, as we know, will only benefit the evil because they're the only ones who aren't going to follow the laws.
And when a perpetrator gets shot, that's say a robbery, that's called a robbery gone wrong.
That's correct.
And I would say, no, that's a robbery gone right.
Yes, once again, they're diametrically opposed to all that is good, right, and successful. I'll give you another example. It boggles our mind, right-thinking people. It blows our mind how it is that the media and and academia and other leftists can look at the Middle East, see this one tiny liberal democracy of Israel, with its freedom of speech and freedom of religion, with its women's rights, with a woman prime minister in the 1960s, with gay pride parades, all the things liberals are supposed to care about and love, and they see surrounding them are the most oppressive, misogynistic, homophobic, mass murdering, corrupt terrorist dictatorships. And what do they decide? That the reason that there's not peace in the Middle East is because the Jews aren't giving in enough to the terrorists. How do they come to this? Because they're not allowed to see the Muslim world as wrong, because that could just be their prejudices. The opposite of indiscriminateness is the evil of discrimination. So because they must see, let's say, the Palestinians and the Israelis both want peace, because if the Palestinians don't want peace, then they're a bad people. They're not allowed to think they're a bad people, so they must believe, no matter what the objective facts, that the Palestinians want peace. But if the Palestinians want peace, why are they blowing up buses in Jerusalem? Obviously, some Jew must have provoked them, because otherwise they would be bad people.
Yeah, those little Eichmanns had it coming.
Exactly. And by the way, they do. And, of course, a lot of liberals do call Israel an apartheid state. Jimmy Carter wrote a book called Peace, Not Apartheid, as if the Jews and not Islam. Islam's the most apartheid ideology next to Hitlerism.
And in practice. You know, I was glad you included Honduras in your examples of being against anything that goes right and trying to pull it down and do away with it. Israel, of course, being a big example, but Honduras was a case where there was a pro-Chavez thug that had pulled off a coup. The Congress had resorted to the Constitution. That's where they started to get into trouble.
They resorted to the law, to democracy, and to freedom, and therefore Obama was against it.
Yeah, so they called in another president after having deposed Zelaya, and boy, did the newspapers and all of the talking heads come down on these folks. It's as if they had started a concentration camp.
Absolutely. And if you remember, that was one example of many that I gave of Obama and the revolutions that cropped up across the globe during his tenure. And you had him oppose the democratic uprising in Iran, support the overthrow of the man who had kept the peace for 30 years in Egypt and America's ally, Mubarak. Honduras was another example that I gave. And, of course, that he did nothing as a second-generation mass murderer, mowed his own people down in the streets. Larry, think about this. In Iran, the democratic revolution, had it succeeded, might have overthrown an enemy of America. In Egypt, the revolution overthrew an ally of America. In Honduras, the coup was to overthrow an ally of America. In every single case, Obama supported the side that was an enemy of America.
EvansSayet.com, EvansSayet.com. That's where you can get the Kindergarten of Eden that we're talking about today. And I wanted to direct us to the kind of emotional overkill that is frequently the only form of argument that our poor liberal friends are able to engage in. It was in full display. Well, it is almost every evening on TV, but at least personally, when I was doing the Piers Morgan show, rapidly, Mr. Morgan ran out of any arguments, and so he began to stream a series of invective and ad hominem, and he never wanted to come back to these troubling facts like bodies getting stacked up in gun-free zones time after time after time, and instead I became little, stupid, evil, and I probably don't even remember all the other expletives that he was hurling, but it struck me when I was reading your description of this form of emoting that's why we so frequently encounter when talking with a liberal friend or contact that you're just a racist. It may have absolutely nothing to do with the color of skin or segregation or anything like that, but you're just a racist because I can't beat you in an argument.
Well, the reason is this. It's in the very first law of the unified field theory of liberalism, which is that the opposite of indiscriminateness is the evil of discrimination. You're a racist because you think. Thinking is an act of bigotry. And because, and this is how I word it in some articles I've written, this isn't in the book, but I say having come to their positions without benefit of fact or reason, because fact and reason are bigoted notions, without benefit of having come to their positions without benefit of fact or reason, when it comes time to try to persuade others, they don't have those weapons. So when you brought up the fact Piers Morgan had nothing he could say because he didn't come to his position by thinking it through. So when it came time to debate you, he was incapable of doing it. And in fact, you will find this with literally every modern liberal. In fact, try this. This is in the book. This is in the book, The Kindergarten of Eden. Try to name a single issue, Larry, even one. And I'm asking your listeners as well. Try to name a single issue where the Democratic Party's argument is an affirmation of what they believe. In other words, they explain what it is they believe, why it is they believe it, how it works, how it will be paid for, where it has worked before. You can't name one. Every single Democratic Party argument is exactly the same. We're right because we're morally superior to you, and anybody who disagrees is a bigot, a racist, a xenophobe, a homophobe, an Islamophobe, or a greedy liar. There is never once where they say, oh, I see your point, here's why I disagree. They can't, because they did not engage in rational thinking to come to their position in the first place. So when it comes time to argue on behalf of their position, they simply have no ammunition.
No, and besides, you're evil, therefore why should they even try? You made a very interesting point, something that we can almost objectify, the cost of the social unraveling that is produced by this kind of kindergarten, perpetual 5-year-old thinking. When morality is strong, fewer cops are needed. Isn't that's really a stunning observation? It's true.
And by the way, this is why I wholly disagree with the notion when I hear somebody say, well, I'm a fiscal conservative but a social liberal. There's no such thing as a socially liberal, fiscally conservative human being, because one of the reasons that these social norms have come to be is because over time they prove themselves to be efficient both morally and economically. You know, if your child is not sleeping around, he's probably not going to get a sexually transmitted disease, which requires hospitalization.
Maybe what they're referring to, Evan, when they say that they're fiscal conservatives and social liberals, is that they want to see that the books are balanced at the whorehouse. Just asking.
You know what's funny, Larry? Nobody who's not listening to the show doesn't know that I just wrote a new joke.
Well, I was hoping it might get recycled. A little impishness in me just couldn't keep it until later.
Well, you made it almost the whole show without it, so
yeah, it just came out. Yeah, I couldn't control it anymore. But I thought you're pegging it down to the level of the 5-year-old. If folks can understand a kindergartner, then you kind of get a hold of the emotional state and the rational or lack thereof condition of the people we're talking about.
That's right. And by the way, I want to make it abundantly clear. When I say the modern liberal, and this is how I word it, the modern liberal has been morally and intellectually retarded at the level of the 5-year-old child. Right, that is not hyperbole. That is not just gratuitous slander. I quite literally mean
it's a clinical description.
Yes, it is a diagnosis. And by the way, it's a diagnosis that has been made by others. There was a book in the 1980s, a best-selling New York Times book by Dr. Dan Kiley called The Peter Pan Syndrome. And he noticed this syndrome that was taking place and has only gotten worse since then, where he said at the very beginning of the book, take a look at your child and ask yourself what would happen if his body grew up but his mind didn't. Mm-hmm. And there's a book written by a liberal, and this was one of the biggest selling books of all time. It remains 20 years later in the top 0.5% of all books sold on Amazon, where this liberal proudly declared that all I ever really need to know, I learned in kindergarten. This is what they believe, because for a good many of them, it's been true. Again, they've not had to think any deeper than a kindergartner, because they never had to think about how to avoid disease, hunger, poverty, or physical pain. And a great many of them fall into one of two categories. You know, the conventional wisdom, which is a lie, but it's been perpetrated and perpetuated by the leftist media, is that the Republicans are the party of the rich. That's not true. The Democrats are the party of the rich.
I wish the Republicans were the party of the rich. I would like to know some more rich people. Maybe I could get rich, too.
Well, I wish I had rich in-laws or rich, yeah. It's funny how I'm supposed to do all these things that I'm just not. But the Democrats are the party of the rich, the very rich, the very, very rich, and the very, very, very rich. And at the other end, they're the party of the poor. They're the party of the people who've either failed because of their bad behavior or who are simply living off of welfare in society. That's the Democratic Party. Now, of course, there are exceptions. There are union members who are simply selfish and vote Democrat for selfish reasons. But almost the entirety of the Democratic Party today is made up of the super rich Democrats and the failures. And everybody else in the middle votes Republican. And by the yes, sir.
I'm just thinking the cultural arrogance of their position. Frank Rich, a New York Times pontificator. What's the matter with Kansas is one of his book of opinings. You've nailed him, my friend. You've really nailed him. The Kindergarten of Eden, How the Modern Liberal Thinks, and Why He's Convinced That Ignorance is Bliss. Folks, you really need to get a copy of this book and get a mastery of what Evan Sayet is talking about at evansayet.com. You can blow up a few liberal heads and just have a jolly good time.
The Bill of Rights protects every American's God-given right to keep and bear arms. Now that right is being seriously undermined as legally registered rifles are being confiscated in some parts of our country. If we're not careful, we may find ourselves with no right to own guns. And that's where Gun Owners of America comes in. Gun Owners of America is in Washington every day fighting for you to keep that right. Congressman Ron Paul has called GOA the only no-compromise gun lobby in Washington. You need to be part of this great grassroots group of activists who are keeping the heat on their members of Congress. Find out right now how you can join. Call 888-886-GUNS and get started receiving their fact-filled newsletters and action alerts. Call 888-886-GUNS or go to their webpage at gunowners.org and help make your voice heard in Washington. Make that call right now and call Gun Owners of America at 888-886-GUNS. Remember, it's not just about gun control, it's about control.